I think that there's one lingering issue from the Diablo 4 beta weekend that we really need to come together and wrap our heads around if people are going to be able to give the game a fair shot walking into the second weekend, and that's the concept of scaling. For people who don't know, monsters in Diablo 4 are going to scale to your level, and a lot of people have a lot of issues with it. And the video footage that I'm overlaid over would be from my last stream of the weekend, where I had a pretty high energy, let's say, response to people asking about scaling, because by the end of the weekend, I'll be honest with you, I was pretty frustrated with having to answer the same questions over and over and over again, and dispelling the same parroted bad takes, bad faith arguments, and just misconceptions about how it's implemented in Diablo 4. So I don't want to waste too much of your time. I'm going to try to debate the 5 biggest arguments that I've seen made against scaling in Diablo 4. I'll have timestamps to all of them down below, so you can just jump to the ones that particularly interest you, and let's get into it. So when we're talking about the issues with scaling, or first off, let's just very quickly again define what scaling means in Diablo 4. Just in case you skipped straight to this timestamp. Monsters in Diablo 4 are going to scale to your level, as in they scale up with you. If I'm level 20, random monsters in the open world, as well as in some dungeons, are also level 20. So their life, damage mitigation versus me are all going to scale proportionally. And the interesting part is the first 3 primary arguments that I see against scaling argue against themselves, but they're all kind of parroted simultaneously. The first one is that you never get stronger. The second one is that you actually get weaker. The third one being that you're never challenged. The fourth one being that it makes content somehow irrelevant. And then lastly, you never get to have your revenge. Now, before you jump to the other time slots, I just want to check in on that 5th one there. As a person who comes from playing EverQuest since I was a kid into my late teens, I loved getting stronger and then going back and smashing content. I absolutely understand this one to a certain degree, but again, I have counter arguments against it. Being able to go back into the Western Eastern Common Lands on my Dark Elf fighter and being able to get my vengeance in all of the Druid circles who tried to deny me the ability to sell items was pretty sweet, don't get me wrong. But let's start with the first argument: you never get stronger. Now, this is something that I was seeing a lot, and I think it's almost strictly based in a misunderstanding of just how powerful a single level up for a character is. So I kind of just want to try to detail it. I'm going to have the video where I talked about this part in the background. Right here, let's talk about singular skill points. I'm using the example of Upheaval. The base damage that Upheaval does, if you have your advanced tooltips on, you're able to see the actual numbers, starts at 70% of your weapon damage. The next point in Upheaval is going to get you an additional 7% of your weapon damage. So that's a 10% increase in the total weapon damage that you're doing from point to point. And bare minimum, a 10% increase to your overall damage from your most important core skill, I think is more than enough to kind of debunk this argument right here, which is that you don't get stronger with each skill point. So while I can understand not necessarily understanding that like one skill point can bare minimum equate to a 10% increase in damage output, the idea that skills are just these 1-point wonders and that's why people want to have more skill tabs and be able to bind more skills because they have a point in 10 different skills that they want to use, I think is again all centered around the idea that like you misunderstanding just how important it is to increase the base damage of your most important skills. The next thing that I point out is that not every skill that you put in is just a do more damage ability. The first enhancement of Upheaval on a Barbarian makes our AoE damage skill now have a 20% chance to stun monsters for 2.5 seconds. It just has that now. It just has become a CC AoE massive damage nuke. That gets us better survivability in combat, makes combat more tactical, and it's hard to evaluate just how powerful a 5th of the time stunning a target for 2.5 seconds is. So I can't just give you a number here, but anybody who's played an ARPG for long enough knows that adding on that much CC to an area of effect skill for a single skill point is a much bigger increase than, let's just say, 10% damage output. Point number 2 is that you actually get weaker. And I'm not going to rehash everything that I just said because I've technically already debunked this part of the mythos of scaling But I do want to explain the argument. If you believe that a single skill point is not relevant and your base stats going up isn't relevant, and later on when you get a paragon point won't be relevant, the idea is that all of the monsters have gotten stronger because they're going to do more damage, take less damage from you. Your armor is going to account for less mitigation. Their armor is going to account for more mitigation, etc. And you haven't gotten better gear yet. That's technically true. The issue being that the moment that you are a higher level, the monsters are a higher level, and they're able to drop higher item power worth of gear. That means that all of the gear that you now pick up is more powerful on average than any gear you should technically have right now or you've seen before. So let's say you somehow leveled up and now it is a challenge to fight these monsters. Not only do I just see that as like a valuable and important aspect of games being challenged in general, but it also means that all of that gear that you might have been bored with seeing because you haven't been finding any upgrades have now gained the potential to be upgrades. And they will be upgrades. Leveling 1 through 25, I was replacing my gear all of the time, and I think a little bit of this is kind of drowned in the fact that people are not yet comfortable with how the game is communicating items' power or relevance or value to you. I'm going to be putting out a second video that's basically you should really look into these 5 things that you can do in the game to make it a better experience for you. But if you didn't know, you can activate advanced tooltips on your gear and on your skills. That's why if your skill screen looked a little bit different than mine there, and my gear here looks a little bit different than yours, it's because it's showing me all of the information. It shows me the ranges that the affixes on my gear can have, and gear that's higher item level can roll higher on affixes and have stronger total affixes on them. So while you could almost believe the argument that you have now become weaker in comparison because your gear hasn't gotten there yet, I would argue that that means that the game has just given you a challenge to go get gear and actually feel rewarded and enjoy finding the gear, as opposed to just having gear that is not an upgrade for you rain down on you continuously. And that seems like a net win for me. Maybe I'm missing something here. All in all, I completely disagree with this point. But even in the ways within which you could say it's technically true, it just leads to a better gameplay experience. So it is not really a knock against scaling in the first place. And I guess that's all I can really say about it. Argument number 3 is that you are never challenged because the monsters scale with you, so they're always your level, so you're never actually challenged by anything. The irony of this issue is that number 2 is specifically the concept that you get weaker in comparison, which would inherently make the game more challenging. And also argument number 1, where you never get stronger, which theoretically would make all of the content more challenging if you never got stronger and you simultaneously got weaker. But let's talk about all the areas where monsters do not scale with you. Remember that scaling only goes one way. Monsters scale up with you, they never scale down to you. In the overworld, we had the world boss who did not scale down to our level, and you can only assume that as you increase world tier, where you can literally go read the fact that monsters will be stronger, they'll do more damage, they'll be more accurate, they'll take less damage from you, but their levels will also be higher. So world bosses in higher tiers are almost certainly also going to be higher level than the characters can be in that world tier realistically. The second example were strongholds. Strongholds were level 35 regions. So literally we could not get up to be high enough level there. The monsters didn't scale down to you. And remember that monsters being higher level than you means they take less damage from you and they do more damage to you. In the third example, there were super unique monsters walking around that were also just higher level than you. Everybody fought that one burning guy who gave you the cool white hand rune bound mace. He was just higher level than you. So you have world bosses, you have special event super unique monsters, and you have strongholds that are all higher level than you that most people probably saw in the beta. Not only that, if you looked, we had core quest lines that were almost certainly tied to either some type of dungeon or boss that would be required to finish the act story there, that also had recommended levels assigned to them. Now we couldn't go and see these because we couldn't leave the starter area, but those quests having at least an indicator of level with them means that that content almost certainly also does not scale with the player, or at the very least will be higher level than the character until you surpass it and then scale with you at that point. Where else might we find places where you will continue to be challenged? Well, that's almost certainly in Nightmare Dungeons. if you didn't go to the occultist and look, you're able to craft these sigils, which will basically imbue a dungeon with the nightmare affixes, which will continue to add challenges as well as debuffs to the players. So once a player gets to max level of 100, the monsters probably won't continue to go up in levels in overworld content and general content, but in Nightmare Dungeons, where you're able to continuously up the ante by adding more and more affixes to the dungeon, you're almost certainly going to see stuff like increased base monster level, increased base monster damage and defenses, decrease player damage, slow down the players, increase stun duration time. You get the idea here. And this is even without looking at stuff like PvP, whatever's going to be happening in Helltide zones, as well as whatever the Tree of Whispers is going to offer us for challenges. There are going to be scenarios in this game where the monsters are just not our level, and we can expect them to be able to exceed even our own level, even at max level. Argument number 4 that I saw a lot was that it makes content irrelevant. And now this one took a lot of different forms. It wore a lot of different masks. It went from one side of the paradigm, which was that there's no reason for me to go back to starter areas if everything that I go to is equal to my level. Why would I go back and fight in the fantasy of the world weaker monsters? To the other side, which was if everything scales, then I'll only do the content that I'm best at, so I never have a reason to go to different areas. This one's a bit more ephemeral, and I guess it comes down to taste, but at least let me take a whack at debating the core concept, which is that it makes content irrelevant. If all content, other than the ones that are gated behind story or Nightmare Dungeon sigils, or specific events in the overworld, if everything else, the things that actually do scale, are always relevant for me to be fighting in, meaning the monsters are always going to be worth experience, they're always going to be challenging according to my level, and that they're always going to be dropping loot, which is according to their level, meaning it's always relevant for me to be picking it up, then all content is relevant. Are you somebody who just like really likes farming in the starting zone because you liked the wolves and the bears and the frozen carver shamans? Then you just farm there. You can continue to farm there. You can farm there all the way up to level 100. That you could do only that if that's all that you want to do. But let's talk about in games where monsters don't scale with you. I'm going to use World of Warcraft as an example. It's one of the games that I have the most time in outside of Diablo and EverQuest. The same things I'm about to say here could be applied to EverQuest as well. In a starter zone, monsters only got up to a certain level. You could choose to farm them because they had drop rates for different types of items. And even in this game, you can still do it. The random wolves and bears that you're killing are going to drop more rawhide and fur, which is necessary for upgrading certain types of gear. So the idea being that being able to go and farm specific areas gets you certain gear. You know, how many people sat there and farmed that one Blood Elf guy to get the Blood Elf Bandit mask, which sold for a ridiculous amount on the auction house, and it was just kind of nice as a transmog item. But you could go do it. He was a low level monster who's in a specific area. You could target farm it. First off, you could still do that in Diablo 4. Different monsters drop different resources that are needed for upgrading certain things. So there just literally is target farming in the game, not to mention the super unique monsters in the game that all drop a specific unique rare item that has specialized stats on it, which is also incredibly cool. So you can target farm them as well. So one, you can still target farm in the game for specific loot. But let's just go back and talk about it. Killing a bunch of monsters that don't really get you money, that don't really get you resources, and don't really get you XP, while something that you can choose to do, very often was something that never was realistically done in those games, except for very specific reasons or reputations, etc. What that means is that starter and newbie zones, in quotations here, are quickly abandoned either at the beginning of a season or at the beginning of an expansion or at the inception of the game itself. While there's an influx of a bunch of new players, these zones become completely dead and irrelevant within a very short period of time. So that forces content to become irrelevant. What this also means is that if you're somebody who just hates running a particular dungeon and you love another one, you wouldn't be hard forced to do the same farming of a specific spot over and over and over again just because it's good for your class. You can choose to go somewhere else and get equal opportunities for gear, gold generation, as well as experience. I'll also liken this to Diablo 2, where in Diablo 2, you just gotta farm Hel Mephisto for a grip to get your gear. And instead of doing that, every class here can go to an area that's good for them, that they're able to min-max, and if they want to, hyper crush farming in an area for significant progression without feeling like they need to go do a particular piece of content to get anything out of it. The last argument, which is sincerely my favorite one, is you never get your revenge. What does this mean for people? It's the idea that if you're never getting stronger, you're actually getting weaker, you're never really being challenged, and simultaneously all content is somehow irrelevant. You never get to go back to places where you were challenged beforehand and come and smash it. This is just wrong. Now, I do get it, and again, the example that I used before in EverQuest is really poignant. I played as a Dark Elf fighter. In EverQuest, if you never played that game before, there was literal racial tension between the different species. It was just straight out racism. The idea was that you needed to build up reputation with other species to be able to trade with them and not be kill on sight. Random NPCs would aggro on you from yards and miles away and just come kill you. This was a big problem. It was something that like every Dark Elf or Ixar player would come to either revile or love about the game. You would go into an area, you'd walk up, and you'd wait to see whether or not an NPC just started charging at you. So once you got high enough level where you were stronger than these NPCs, you could come back and kill them and get your revenge. It was satisfying. It was a really funny thing. I feel like it was a trial everybody kind of had to get through to really earn their chops in the game. So I do understand the concept. Do not get me wrong. I like the idea of being able to go back and crush content, but you can just do that here in this game. The bonuses that you get from legendary aspects and how it scales your damage, and how at the point I am at level 25 where everything should be my same level and not be able to get crushed, I just am. And this comes again from familiarity with the systems, where you're going to understand how to scale your damage better. You're going to have stronger builds. Your character is going to become stronger because they have better gear. And then the amount of a challenge any one thing poses to you should get mitigated more and more and more by the overwhelming amount of progression power-wise your character is able to make. Now, on top of that, there are world tiers in this game. Going between world tiers in this game is going to gate you from certain items dropping or not dropping. But if you just needed that power fantasy where you're like, I need to go show Ashava who's boss, I'm gonna drop down to world tier 1, wait for the world boss spawn, walk up as my max level character, and then hurt this world boss. You can do that. Is it just something therapeutic that you just need? You can do that. That's it. End concept. You can go get your revenge. You can just do it. It's something that you can do fairly easily. There we go. Those are the arguments that I currently see against scaling in Diablo 4 and how it's somehow going to ruin this game. And in a lot of ways, I just really cannot disagree any stronger than I currently am. But I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? Am I missing some points? Are there aspects to this I'm just missing? Maybe I'm not looking at it enough from a casual perspective, although I do think that I try to keep the casual perspective in mind more often than I see other people do, because oddly enough, most people don't semi-professionally play video games and don't have a million hours to know life into this game in particular. So scaling is a way to help them continuously be playing a game where they feel adequately challenged while simultaneously rewarded for their gameplay and their time investment. So I'd love to hear from you. Again, let me know what you think. If I managed to convince you against all the evil horrors of scaling, let me know down in the comments as well, because I think it might go a long way to help other people see the perspective being shared from multiple situations and multiple viewpoints, or get more people involved and aligned with the concept that there's really only one good way of implementing this in most games at this point, and I feel like it solves so many more issues than the ones that it theoretically causes. Again, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I also hope that you're looking forward to playing in the open beta this upcoming weekend. The most important thing for me as part of this community, and as well as this consumer base and just people buying products, is getting our hands on a thing, be able to test it and figure out if it's right for us, so that we don't end up wasting money that we end up regretting. So if you have some time, make sure to jump into this beta if you didn't play in the last one, get your hands on it and really get a feel for it, because I would hate for someone to jump into this game and realize that it's just not for them when they could have had the opportunity to avoid that now. So make some time this weekend. I hope to see you in Sanctuary, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.